The millionaire checked his home security cameras and noticed some really unusual behavior from his housekeeper. Upon closer inspection, he realized it was just a young girl who had been secretly working in his house for 13 days straight and wasn't able to attend school. The truth that later unfolded brought him to tears. Alara held the aluminum spoon, carefully ladling thin soup into 3 plastic bowls. She calculated precisely. Her mother's bowl needed more liquid for easy swallowing. Leo's bowl required a few extra small potato pieces to fuel his energy for play. The rest of the broth-clear liquid was for her. Alara was 13, but the way she managed these meager resources was remarkably skillful. Under the dim light of their queen's apartment, Clara lay on an old mattress. Her breathing was labored, each rise and fall of her chest a visible struggle, as if she were carrying an invisible boulder. Clara had been working 12-hour shifts at the upscale estates in Connecticut to keep her 2 children afloat. Now, her body had given up. In the corner of the room, Leo sat silently amidst the broken plastic pieces of a toy truck. He didn't hear the screech of the subway outside the window, nor his mother's dry cough. Leo's world was a series of silent images. He looked at Alara, his large round eyes filled with apprehension. Alara approached, making a sign with her hands. "Eat, Leo. I have extra potatoes for you here." Leo nodded, taking the bowl of soup but keeping his eyes on the front door. The door suddenly swung open. Gareth stepped in, bringing a rush of cold air and the pungent aroma from the cheap bars beneath the bridge. He did not look at his wife, nor at the children. Gareth began rifling through the kitchen cabinets. "Where's the cash? I know you keep a jar hidden around here." Alara stood in front of the small cabinet next to the stove. "That's for Leo's hearing aid batteries. Mom worked extra night shifts all week for that. You can't take it." Gareth brushed Alara's hand aside. He found the ceramic jar behind a pile of old spices. The crumpled bills were yanked out. Gareth stuffed them into his pants pocket, a look of triumph clearly visible on his face. "I need this for a business arrangement. Don't look at me that way. If I don't get more cash by the end of the week, your old TV and those books of yours will be going to the pawn shop." "Got it?" Gareth departed, leaving a chilling silence. Alara looked at the empty jar. All her calculations about helping Leo hear the birds sing next spring had dissolved into thin air. Just then, the landline rang. Alara picked up. "Clara Vance." "This is Perkins at the Sterling estate. Why haven't you confirmed your schedule for tomorrow morning? Mr. Sterling requires perfect readiness for breakfast at 6 o'clock. If you are not present tomorrow morning, we will find a permanent replacement. No exceptions. You know the boss's guidelines." Alara looked at her mother. Clara was still delirious, her face pale from the pneumonia fever. She looked over at Leo, who was trembling and covering his ears tightly, though he couldn't hear a thing. Alara knew that if they lost this job, they would be out on the street right in the middle of winter. She opened her mother's closet and pulled out the gray housekeeper uniform. The outfit was far too large. Alara stood in front of the mirror using safety pins to secure the waistline. She rolled up the sleeves multiple times, using a dark scarf to conceal the open neckline. She took scissors, shortened the pant legs herself, and taped the hem inside. Under the dim light, if she kept her face lowered and maintained a rigid posture, she looked like a small woman who had endured much hardship. Alara slipped her basic physics book into her backpack. It was her most prized possession, her only hope for understanding the world outside the confined Queens area. She took the remaining dry piece of bread, wrapping it in a napkin. Alara sat down next to her mother's bed, quickly writing a note for Leo. "Leo, I'm going to work for Mom. Stay home and watch Mom and keep the door locked tight. Don't open it for anyone, even Uncle Gareth. I'll bring home something to eat. Bertin TT." 4 o'clock in the morning. Alara stepped out of the dilapidated apartment building. The cold wind from the East River made her shiver. She walked along the rundown streets heading toward the subway station. Her small footsteps echoed on the garbage-strewn sidewalk. Alara clutched the strap of her backpack, feeling the weight of the physics book on her shoulder, like a reminder of her future. Under the platform, she blended into the crowd of early morning workers, tired faces, vacant eyes staring into the void. Alara pulled her wool hat down low, trying to hide the face of a 13-year-old child. A man standing nearby looked down at her old canvas shoes, but Alara quickly turned away. The subway train pulled into the station. A strong gust of wind tousled Alara's dark hair. She stepped into the car, finding a dark corner to sit down. This was the train taking her away from Queens, heading toward Connecticut, where the glass castles and the men of steel were waiting. Alara clenched her small hands, her heart pounding relentlessly. I have to manage this, for Leo, for Mom. The subway door slammed shut. The screech of metal echoed as the train rushed into the dark tunnel. Alara looked through the window, seeing only her own reflection in the glass, a small shadow stepping into the high-stakes world of the powerful. The train accelerated, completely severing her path back to the harsh reality in Queens. The train halted at the Greenwich station. Alara stepped off, feeling the rush of cold air into her lungs, a pure, bland air, unlike the thick, smoky smell of Queens. She tightened her grip on her backpack, walking along the tree-lined streets that led to the colossal iron gates of the Sterling estate. Alara stood before the guard booth. She kept her head down, passing her mother's ID card through the small glass slot. The security officer didn't look up. His eyes were glued to a screen showing a live soccer match. The commentator's voice blared from a small speaker. The guard took the card, swiped it through the scanner, and returned it with a dismissive wave of his hand. Go on in. You're 2 minutes behind schedule. Alara sighed with relief, stepping through the slowly opening iron gate. Before her was a structure of glass and pristine white marble, radiating a chilling silence. The Sterling estate did not feel like a home. It felt like a stronghold constructed to separate its owner from the rest of the world. Stepping inside, Alara realized the walls were taller than she could have imagined. She stood in the great hall, feeling as small as a grain of sand. Mrs. Perkins appeared from behind a corridor, holding a list of chores. She looked at Alara's old shoes, then up at the low-pulled wool hat. Clean the study and the library first. Mr. Sterling does not wish to see anyone when he's having breakfast. Make everything sparkle. Mrs. Perkins left after handing the girl a cart full of cleaning supplies. Alara began the physical struggle. The heavy vacuum cleaner seemed intent on pulling her down to the floor. To wipe the marble statues that towered over her, Alara tied a cloth to the end of a long pole, securing it with a thin wire. She maneuvered the pole using the principles of leverage to clean hard-to-reach spots without a ladder. When she had to move a heavy velvet armchair to mop the floor, Alara didn't strain herself by pulling. She slid an old silk rug underneath the chair legs, then used her body weight to gently push. The chair glided smoothly across the marble floor. Alara worked furiously. Sweat soaked the back of her uniform shirt, but she didn't stop. She understood that perfection was the only ticket allowing her to return tomorrow. The sound of the elevator door opening echoed from the end of the hall. Alistair Sterling stepped out. He resembled a commanding presence in his perfectly tailored dark suit. Alistair walked quickly, his eyes fixed on the tablet in his hand. He wore a small earpiece. He didn't look left or right, nor did he notice the child huddled in the dark corner of the bookshelf. Alistair paused mid-hallway, his finger rapidly scrolling across the screen. He began speaking into his earpiece. I don't care about the mitigating provisions. My sister's medical records were changed. That negligence cannot be covered up with money. Find me the medical professional who signed that report. I want him out of the medical practice immediately." Alara held her breath. She stood perfectly still among the towering bookshelves, feeling the cold radiating from Alistair's voice. He continued pacing back and forth, his steps decisive on the stone floor. Lydia trusted them. That deceit took her life. I will uncover every single person involved in this legal action. Their counsel is attempting to delay, but I have plenty of time and resources to see this through. Alistair stopped right in front of the bookshelf where Alara was concealed. He turned off the tablet, his breathing heavy. His anger did not surface in volatile actions. It condensed into his cold gray gaze. He raised a hand to rub his forehead, revealing the exhaustion of a man shouldering the burden of retaliation. Alistair opened the leather-bound document file he was holding, flipping through the pages filled with signatures and red seals. A breeze from the slightly open window blew through, causing the papers to rustle. Alistair flinched, and the thick file slipped from his hand, falling onto the marble floor. The pristine white documents scattered everywhere. Alistair stood frozen, looking at the mess at his feet with visible impatience. Alara didn't hesitate. The reflexes of a caretaker ingrained from years of helping her mother around the house took over. She rushed out of the dark corner, dropping to her knees on the floor. Alara's small, rough hands swiftly gathered the papers. Just then, Alistair also bent down to retrieve the file. The millionaire's large, smooth hand touched the leather cover at the same moment as Alara's thin fingers. The rough texture of the working child's skin sharply contrasted with Alistair's softness. He froze, his keen eyes slowly, looking up directly into Alara's frightened face beneath the wool hat. Alistair narrowed his eyes, his hand still gripping the edge of the file, not letting go. Silence enveloped both of them, broken only by Alara's frantic heartbeat in her chest. She realized she had just made the biggest mistake, allowing herself to be seen. Alistair still held the edge of the file tightly, his gaze fixed on the small, trembling fingers. Alara felt her heart trying to jump out of her chest. She summoned all her courage, tugged the documents free, and placed the file neatly on the walnut table. She backed up 2 steps, bowing her head so low her chin touched her chest. "I apologize. I didn't mean to." Alara deliberately deepened her voice, creating a hoarse, rough sound. Alistair squinted at the small figure cowering in the oversized uniform. His earpiece transmitted the urgent voice of his lawyer. Alistair took a deep breath, picked up the file, and turned to leave. He didn't have time to dwell on a clumsy servant. "Be more careful next time. Don't touch my belongings without authorization." Alara stood still until the sound of Alistair's footsteps faded behind the elevator door. She let out a heavy exhale, her legs collapsing onto the cold stone floor. This was day 2. She still had 11 more days to get through. On the 3rd day, Alara began tidying Alistair's private bathroom. When she opened the medicine cabinet, she found a jumbled mess. Bottles of pain relievers, dietary supplements, and sleeping pills were piled on top of each other. Alara picked up a bottle of sleeping pills. The label indicated they had expired 6 months ago. The instinct of someone accustomed to caring for her mother and younger brother kicked in. She didn't just wipe away dust. Alara began sorting the entire medicine cabinet. She grouped fever reducers in one corner, vitamins in another, and nervous system support medications in the center. She gathered all expired bottles into a trash bag. During her lunch break on the 4th day, Alara sat in a hidden corner of the kitchen. She pulled a small pencil stub and a crumpled piece of scratch paper from her pocket paper she'd just retrieved from the waste bin in Alistair's study. Alara's mind was focused entirely on Leo. His hearing aid had started emitting a loud crackling sound, causing Leo distress. Alara flipped the scratch paper over which originally bore dry stock market charts. She began to draw. The outlines of the cochlear structure and the electronic schematic of the hearing aid gradually appeared. She recalculated the wiring connection points, hoping to fix it herself when she returned home that evening. At the same time, in the upstairs study, Alistair was battling insomnia. Memories of Lydia, the medical negligence, and the ineffective medications kept haunting him. Alistair entered the bathroom intending to find a sleeping pill. He opened the medicine cabinet door and stopped short. The usual disarray had vanished. Alistair touched the bottles arranged in a perfect order, exactly as a professional pharmacist would organize them. This level of meticulousness far surpassed what was expected of an ordinary housekeeper. Alistair picked up the vitamin bottle, looking at the label that was rotated perfectly forward. A feeling of unease crept into his mind. Mrs. Perkins, who cleaned my bathroom, Alistair asked over the intercom system as he stepped into the hallway. Mrs. Perkins answered promptly from the other end. Still Clara, Mr. Sterling. Is there an issue? No, just, she was extremely thorough. Alistair disconnected the call. He went down to the library, intending to review the end-of-day financial reports to force himself to focus on work. He sat at his desk, pulling the file the servant had just delivered. Alistair flipped through the pages, his hand abruptly stopping between pages 12 and 13. A strange piece of paper had been mistakenly tucked in. Alistair pulled out the paper. It was a discarded sheet of his own scratch paper, but the back was no longer blank. He stared intently at the pencil drawing. It was an astonishingly detailed anatomical diagram of the human cochlea, accompanied by handwritten notes on sound frequency and the circuit diagram for a hearing device. The handwriting was small, sharp, and lucid. Alistair sprang to his feet, his wooden chair hitting the bookshelf behind him with a loud impact. He held the paper, moving toward the large computer screen on his desk. He logged into the home security system, accessing the surveillance camera feed in the kitchen area. Alistair rewound the footage about 2 hours. The screen displayed the image of the small housekeeper sitting hunched over. She wasn't eating the bread. She was diligently drawing on the scratch paper with a peculiar intensity. Alistair zoomed in on the image, his gray eyes narrowing as he saw her take off her wool hat to wipe away sweat, revealing a face far too young for the identity of Clara Vance. Alistair clenched the scratch paper in his hand, his eyes shifting to a predatory observation mode. He didn't pick up the phone to call Mrs. Perkins. He stood silently staring at the child on the screen, who was carefully putting the pencil stub into her uniform pocket. "You are not Clara," Alistair whispered, his hand touching the save button on the video recording. He realized he had just uncovered a secret that lay outside all his financial calculations. Alistair held the paper with the cochlea diagram and walked straight toward the central security control room with cold determination. The girl still had no idea that this fortress had begun aiming cameras solely in her direction. The secret beneath the gray uniform was starting to come to light. Would Alistair open his heart to offer protection, or would he slam the fortress door shut in her face? Don't miss the dramatic developments in the next section. Alistair narrowed his eyes, his finger tracing the image of the paper on the camera monitor. The fragmented pixels turned the cochlea drawing into a blurry gray area. He leaned back in his chair, feeling his suspicion taking deeper root. A regular housekeeper wouldn't spend her break researching anatomy. Alistair picked up the phone and pressed the speed dial for his secretary. "Cancel this afternoon's meeting. I will not be in the office. Email all documents regarding the medical legal action. I'm returning to the estate to retrieve a confidential file." Meanwhile, in the estate kitchen, Alara hid deep inside the dry goods storage room. This was the only blind spot she had found to evade the cold lenses on the ceiling. Alara pulled out her phone and started a video call home. The screen showed Leo's pale face. He was standing in their cramped queen's kitchen, holding a bowl of cold noodles, staring intently at the old microwave that was emitting a distinct static sound and wisps of thin smoke. Alara panicked, her hands moving swiftly across the screen. "Leo, unplug it immediately. Don't touch the oven door. Listen to me pull the cord out." Leo looked at his sister through the screen, his eyes revealing the terror of a child isolated in a world without sound. He signed with trembling hands. "Sister, it smells burnt, I'm afraid." "Calm down and look at me. Watch my hands. Walk around to the back, grab the black cord, pull it out hard. Do it, Leo. I'm here with you." Alara held her breath, watching her brother's every movement. Only when Leo managed to unplug the cord and the smoke stopped rising did she allow herself to breathe a sigh of relief. She signed to him again. "Is Mom still feverish? Remember to use a warm cloth to wipe her hands. Okay, I will try to come home as early as possible." A sound from the estate's side door startled Alara. She quickly ended the call, tucked the phone into her uniform pocket, and stepped out. Alistair had returned. He walked on the thick carpet, his footsteps completely silent in the tranquil space. He did not go straight to his study, but stood quietly in the mezzanine hallway, listening for the smallest sounds in the house. The silence now held an unusual rhythm for him. A delivery vehicle stopped in front of the main entrance. Two men carried in a large wooden crate containing stone decorative garden statues. "Sign here. Heavy stuff, watch your back." They set the crate right in the middle of the hall and left. Alara looked at the enormous wooden crate with anxiety. She knew Alistair utterly disliked clutter in the main entryway. If he saw this, he would be furious with Mrs. Perkins, and her mother would bear the consequences. Alara looked around, finding no one to help. She approached the crate. Alistair stood above the railing looking down. From this vantage point, he saw the housekeeper's figure engulfed in the oversized uniform. She didn't try to use brute force to lift the crate. Instead, she fetched a small felt floor mat, wedging it under one corner of the wooden box. Next, she used a long iron poker from the fireplace tool set to pry up one end of the crate. She shifted the crate little by pushing it to slide on the mat to reduce friction with the stone floor. This action required an understanding of physics more than muscle power. Alistair watched in silence. The Clara he knew was a plump, middle-aged woman who would call security for help instead of using her intellect like this. The physical frailty of the figure below completely contradicted the personnel file of a long-time manual laborer. Alistair did not go down to the hall. He quietly returned to the central control room, locking the door behind him. He held the detective's report about a competitor, but his mind was entirely on the surveillance screen. Alistair rewound the footage from the main hall just moments ago. He zoomed in as far as possible on the housekeeper's wrist as she reached out to push the lever. That wrist was thin and small, so much so that the uniform's cuff slid down to her elbow. Alistair hit the freeze frame button. He adjusted the sharpness, focusing on a small object on the housekeeper's left wrist. It was a cheap plastic wristwatch, pale pink. On the watch face was a cartoon cat smiling with large round eyes. He stared intently at the screen. That watch was for a child. Alistair leaned back in his chair, his breathing becoming shallow. No 40-year-old woman would wear such a toy to work in a multi-million-dollar estate. He realized he was facing a deception even greater than he had imagined. Alistair reached out to touch the screen where the image of the cartoon cat seemed to mock his blindness over the past days. A child was cleaning his palette, sharpening his pencils, and drawing cochlear diagrams during her lunch break. This truth felt like a bucket of cold water thrown directly onto the arrogance of a millionaire who prided himself on control. The Sterling Estates landline phone system suddenly signaled. Alistair instinctively reached for the phone in his study. However, the red indicator light blinking on the control panel showed the call was directed to the dedicated service staff line in the kitchen. Alistair pulled his hand back. He didn't interrupt the call. He pressed the button to activate the integrated intercom's eavesdropping mode. In the kitchen, Alara was startled by the ringing. She quickly wiped her hands stained with floor polish wax on her apron. Alara picked up the receiver silently, thinking Mrs. Perkins might be reminding her about the dinner menu again. "Hello, I'm listening." The voice on the other end was not Mrs. Perkins's sharp tone. Instead, it was a hacking laugh, followed by the wheezing breath and slurred voice of Gareth. "Well, well, my busy girl. Did you think you could hide from me?" Alara felt her entire body stiffen. Her previously injured arm started throbbing. She gripped the edge of the marble counter. The cold stone seemed to be sucking the last bit of warmth from her body. "How do you have this number?" "You underestimate me, Alara. Your mother is lying there like a corpse and her phone isn't locked. I just needed to check the call history to find the address of those wealthy Sterlings. Listen up, I know you received an advance on the pay. I need that cash. Right now." "Uncle Gareth, you already took all the money from the jar. This pay is for Mom's medicine. The electricity bill at home is past due. If we don't pay it, Leo won't have light to practice sign language. Just leave us be." Gareth's voice on the other end suddenly turned menacing. He didn't use his hands, but his every word felt like stones pressing down on Alara's chest. "B. Are you trying to lecture me? I own that house. I will come to that fancy estate myself, knock on the door, and tell your boss that he is illegally employing a child. What do you think he'll do? He'll toss you out and take your mother to court for fraud." "Is that what you want?" Alara gasped. Tears started to stream down her face, but she didn't let out a sob. She tried to keep her voice flat. "You wouldn't dare. If the law enforcement arrive, you'll be taken in for what you've done. Go ahead and try, I have nothing to lose, but you do. If you don't transfer the funds to my account within the hour, I will take Leo away. The group home always has space for useless deaf and mute children. Your mother can't care for him, and I certainly won't. I'll sign the papers relinquishing my parental rights immediately." In the study, Alistair Sterling sat motionless. The words from the intercom speaker struck his ears like hammer blows. Paycheck, mother's medicine, termination of rights. The disjointed pieces of the child in the kitchen suddenly clicked together into a devastating picture. Alistair felt his chest tighten. Memories of his sister Lydia flooded back like a torrent. Alistair recalled the afternoons Lydia called him sobbing about how her ex-husband used custody as leverage for financial gain. At the time, Alistair had replied with the cold tone of a businessman, "Use the law, Lydia. Don't let emotion take over." He had sent her the best lawyers, but he hadn't sent her the protection a brother should provide. He had been too focused on the numbers while his sister was being crushed by the cruelty of a parasite. Gareth's voice sounded again, cutting through Alistair's recollections. 1 hour, Alara. I'm already near your district. I can see those stone walls. What a great place for an attempt to extort money." Alara hung up the phone. She no longer had the strength to stand. Her legs buckled onto the gleaming kitchen floor. Alara hugged her knees, burying her head down. She didn't cry aloud. She just trembled, waves of fear running down her spine. She knew Gareth was a man of his word. He viewed her mother and Leo as mere chips on his gambling table. In the study, Alistair shot up from his seat. His usual composure vanished. In its place was a cold fury. He did not go down to the kitchen to confront Alara. He understood that the child had endured more than enough. Alistair picked up his mobile phone and pressed a speed dial number. "Mark, listen." On the other end was the head of the Sterling Corporation's private security division. Mark's voice was brief. "Yes, Mr. Sterling. Ignore all standard security procedures. I need you to immediately trace the location of the phone number that called the service staff line 5 minutes ago. I want the name, address, credit history, and every legal issue concerning this individual. Do it immediately." "Understood. It will take about 2 minutes to pinpoint the cell tower." Alistair walked toward the large window. He looked down at the road leading to the estate. The maple trees stood silently in the pale afternoon sun. He saw himself as a king standing in his arrogant castle while a monster lurked at the gate and a small warrior was crumbling at the bottom of the stairs. Alistair clenched the pen in his hand so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He promised himself, and perhaps Lydia's soul, that this time he would not just send a lawyer. He would not let his perfection be the wall separating him from the truth for another second. Alistair's phone vibrated. Mark was calling back. "Mr. Sterling, we have the results. The phone number is registered to Gareth Miller. He has a long list of overdue debts and restraining orders from several local gambling venues. But there is more urgent news." Alistair narrowed his eyes. "Tell me." "His phone signal is emitting from the cell tower right next to the Sterling estate gate. He's not far at all. Gareth Miller is standing just outside your security fence." Alistair released the curtain. He stared at the wide-angle security monitor covering the entire entrance to the estate. An old gray car with peeling paint was parked diagonally on the roadside about 20 meters from the main gate. The person inside the car made no attempt to conceal his intentions of lying in wait. Alistair pressed the button to connect with the guard station. Mark reinforced the perimeter patrol along the eastern fence with 2 additional personnel. "Absolutely do not let that vehicle through the gate, but do not confront them to drive them away. I want to see how patient he can be." The other end confirmed briefly. Alistair returned to his desk, but his mind was no longer focused on business reports. He looked at the surveillance monitor for the main hall area. Alara was polishing the brass doorknobs. Her movements were slow and mechanical. She didn't know Gareth was outside, but the instinct of a child who grew up in insecurity allowed her to sense a looming threat. It was past Clara's usual working hours. Mrs. Perkins walked by, glanced at her watch, and then at Alara. "You're working late today, Clara." Alara jumped quickly, wiping an imaginary stain on the wooden door. "I noticed a few smudges on the high bookshelves in the library. I want to take care of them tonight. I'll be in a little late tomorrow to make up for it." She deliberately faked a hoarse voice to reply. Mrs. Perkins nodded without further suspicion. Alara took a deep breath. She didn't want to go home now. She was afraid of the empty subway station. She was afraid of the darkness where Gareth might be waiting to seize the last of her money. She would rather face the exhaustion in this cold estate than confront the nightmare in Queens. Alara carried a wooden stool into the library. She placed the stool next to the tallest bookshelf where the thick leather-bound encyclopedias were stored. She climbed to the highest step. Her body began to protest. Hunger and lack of sleep made her head spin. Alara reached behind a large stack of books, attempting to wipe away the dust accumulated on the wooden ledge. The old stool creaked under the unstable weight. Alara lost her footing. She slipped. By reflex, she did not let go of the bookshelf to maintain her balance, but the momentum of her body pulled her tumbling to the stone floor. A dry, loud thud echoed. Alara was fortunate not to hit her head, but her left elbow struck the sharp edge of the brass tea table. In the surveillance room, Alistair Sterling bolted upright. He held his breath, his eyes glued to the monitor. He waited for Alara to cry out to call for help, or at least to sit on the floor and tend to her injury. Previous servants had made a fuss over a small cut demanding time off, but Alara did not do that. She clenched her teeth so hard that her jaw muscles stood out. She used her right hand to tightly cover her left elbow. Blood began to seep through the gray fabric of her uniform, spreading into a dark red circle. Alara sat motionless in the library's shadows for about 2 minutes, her shoulders shaking violently. When the pain subsided slightly, she staggered to her feet. She didn't call anyone. She quietly headed toward the kitchen prep area where the sink and the staff first aid kit were located. Alistair watched her every step through the camera. He saw her standing at the sink, trembling as she rolled up her sleeve. Under the white fluorescent light in the kitchen, Alistair was stunned. Alara's thin arm was covered with countless bruises. Some were fading yellow, others were fresh blue and purple. Alara took the rubbing alcohol bottle. She poured it directly onto the wound. She used white gauze to wrap her arm tightly, then pulled the uniform sleeve down to conceal everything. Her actions were frighteningly proficient, as if this were a ritual she had to perform every day. A cold current ran down Alistair's spine. He suddenly remembered Gareth. This individual is more than just a drunk trying to extort money, Alistair thought. He looked at the child on the screen who was frantically gathering her cleaning tools. The clock showed 10 o'clock at night. Alara looked up at the clock, her face showing obvious panic. The last train was about to depart. She quickly tossed the dirty cloth into the hamper, slung her backpack over her shoulder, and rushed toward the estate's side door. In her haste, she brushed past the kitchen counter, failing to notice that her worn hardcover notebook remained on the cold stone surface. As soon as the side door closed, Alistair left the surveillance room. He descended the stairs with urgent strides. He pushed open the kitchen door. The air was still heavy with the scent of rubbing alcohol. Moving toward the counter, the notebook lay there like a silent witness. Alistair picked up the book. Inside the notebook, besides the complex drawings of hearing aids, Alistair found a few pieces of paper clipped to the last page. He pulled out the first one. It was an overdue tuition bill from Horizon Special Education School. The beneficiary's name was Leo Vance. The debt had accumulated to an amount that a maid like Clara would have to work for a year without eating to repay. Alistair proceeded to unfold the remaining piece of paper folded into quarters. This was not a bill. He recognized the symbol of the prestigious Manhattan High School at the top corner. Alistair read every line of the dry typewritten text. To the family of student Alara Vance. We regret to inform you that Alara Vance's full talent scholarship is officially revoked as of today. Reason: students' continuous unexcused absences for 10 days and lack of response from a guardian. The school requires the family to complete the withdrawal procedures for this 13-year-old student within the next week. Alistair stood silently in the middle of the kitchen. He clenched the paper in his hand, crumpling it. The final pieces of the puzzle crashed down with a brutal truth. He looked out the window where the darkness had swallowed Alara's small figure. He realized that the 10 days of her absence from school were the 10 days she had been present at this estate, shouldering an entire family's burden on her thin shoulders. 13 years old, Alistair whispered. He felt a wave of shame welling up inside him. He had been proud to be a visionary investor, a millionaire who controlled everything, but he had failed to notice a 13-year-old child performing strenuous labor right under his nose to rescue her younger brother and ailing mother. Alistair turned back to the counter, picking up the phone. He started to call Mark to track Alara, but he stopped. He saw a small smear of blood still left on the sink that Alara hadn't had time to wipe clean in her panic. He grabbed the notebook and the scholarship revocation notice, walking straight toward the study. Alistair's gaze was no longer just curiosity. It was a dangerously certain determination. Gareth was waiting outside the gate, but Alistair knew the cruelest person in this story was not just the abusive stepfather. He picked up the phone and called his private counsel in the middle of the night. "Henderson, I need you to prepare an emergency file, temporary guardianship and evidence of economic abuse. The subject is Gareth Miller. I want enough legal basis to immediately isolate this individual from the Vance family. Don't ask for reasons, just do it. I need it before 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." Alistair hung up. He walked to his desk, opening a secret drawer where he kept an old photo of his sister Lydia. In his eyes, the image of Alara painfully self-treating her injury, and the memory of Lydia's desperate plea for help years ago overlapped. He had let Lydia perish by believing in the rigidity of procedure. This time, Alistair would not allow himself to repeat that mistake. He picked up a pen and began drafting the first lines for a new project, the Lydia and Vance Scholarship Fund. This was not just a charitable foundation, it was a redemption for his own past. While Alistair was outlining the rescue plan, Alara had just stepped out of the Queen's subway turnstile. She was exhausted, her left arm still aching from the fall in the library. The flickering fluorescent lights on the empty platform cast long, eerie shadows. One of those shadows suddenly separated, blocking her path. Gareth Miller stood there reeking of cheap spirits and cigarettes. He sneered, extending his rough hand toward Alara. "Where's the envelope? I know Mrs. Perkins paid your mother's wages today." Alara stepped back, her hand clutching her backpack strap. "I already paid for Mom's medicine. The rest I have to pay for the rent tomorrow morning." "You took everything from the savings jar. Do you want us to starve to death?" Gareth didn't respond. He snatched Alara's small handbag, searching frantically. He pulled out the thin envelope containing a few crumpled dollars, the advance wages Mrs. Perkins had reluctantly given Alara that afternoon. Gareth stuffed the money into his pocket, then leaned his liquor-flushed face close to Alara's ear. "Listen up, you sneaky little girl. I know what you're doing at that estate. Tomorrow is the 13th day, the last day of the agreement, right? Tomorrow morning I will personally meet with the millionaire Sterling. I will tell him he is violating child labor protection guidelines. A lawsuit like that will be incredibly embarrassing for him, and he will be ready to pay a massive settlement for my silence. I will have the money, and you and your mother can move into a shelter and be rid of the debt." Alara felt the blood in her body turn to ice. She wasn't afraid for herself, but she was terrified for Clara and Leo. "You will make Mom lose her job. Mr. Sterling will notify law enforcement to take Mom in for fraud. That's your mother's problem. I will be standing at the gate of that estate tomorrow morning. Don't even think about running Alara." Gareth turned and walked away, leaving Alara standing isolated in the cold station. She ran home, her legs ready to give out from exhaustion. Stepping into the apartment, the sight before her deepened her despair. Clara still lay delirious on the mattress, her pneumonia fever causing her to mumble. Leo was huddled next to his mother, his eyes red from fear. When he saw his sister return, he rushed to cling to Alara's legs, uttering incoherent sounds. Alara knelt on the floor, embracing her brother. She signed to Leo with trembling hands. "Don't be afraid, Leo, I'm here." But Alara herself was terrified to the core. She realized the net was truly closing in. The 13th day, which was meant to be a day of hope, had turned into a judgment for their fragile life. If Gareth followed through on his threat, Alistair Sterling, the man who valued perfection and truth, would surely not forgive this deceit. They would lose everything: her mother's job, their home, and Leo would be taken away. She looked at the physics book on the table, then at her fading mother. Ilara realized that the knowledge in books could not help her withstand Gareth's cruelty or the rigidity of high society. Throughout that night, Alistair also did not sleep in the Sterling estate study. He sat before his computer screen reading the detective's file on Gareth Miller. Each page revealed a dark portrait. Gareth owed 6 underground gambling venues had been investigated for domestic abuse, but evaded charges due to lack of evidence. He was a true parasite, living by draining the life force of those around him. Alistair stood up and paced the room. He wondered why he had lived in wealth for over a decade, yet allowed such a tragedy to unfold right within his home. He had always viewed Clara's labor as just a cost item in the family financial report. He had never asked if she had children or what her life was like after leaving these iron gates. "I was too busy being perfect that I forgot how to see the human being," Alistair told himself. He looked at the wall clock. 5 o'clock in the morning. He knew Gareth would arrive. A greedy individual like Gareth would never miss a chance to attempt to extort money from a man like him. Alistair also knew Ilara would come. That child was too resilient to give up on the final day. He took out the draft of the Lydia and Vance Scholarship Fund, signing his name at the bottom. This was his protective measure, not against poverty, but against the injustice he had inadvertently enabled through his indifference. 6 o'clock in the morning. The faint sunlight pierced through the fog in Greenwich. Alistair stood by the window holding a hot cup of black coffee, but not drinking it. The long-range monitoring system reported an alert. An old gray car was slowly approaching the main gate. Gareth Miller stepped out of the car, straightening his wrinkled clothes with the confident look of someone who believed he held his opponent's weakness. Behind Gareth's car, Ilara stepped off the public bus. She froze when she saw Gareth was already there. Ilara pulled her wool hat down low, her thin shoulders shaking in the cold wind. She didn't dare move forward, but she couldn't turn back either. In the security control room, Security Officer Mark lifted his radio to ask Alistair for guidance. "Mr. Sterling, the same man is here again. He's demanding to see you directly to discuss the Sterling family controversy. He appears very hostile. Should we ask him to leave?" Alistair set the coffee cup down on the table. He looked at the monitor, seeing Gareth rudely tapping on the guard booth glass and seeing Ilara standing motionless like a small ghost in the distance. "No need to turn him away," Alistair replied, his voice firm over the internal system. He walked toward the central control panel, his finger hovering over the main gate activation button. Alistair knew that once this gate opened, his perfect world would collapse, but Ilara's real world would have a chance to begin. "Mark, listen. Open the gate. Allow that man directly into the main parlor. I will receive him there." The estate gate opened, welcoming both the greedy man and the exhausted child. What would be the outcome of the fateful confrontation between the man of steel and the cruel stepfather? The heavy iron gate closed behind Gareth's old car, separating the noisy world of Greenwich from the threatening silence inside the estate. Alistair stood behind the glass of the control room, quietly watching the car inch slowly along the graveled driveway. He did not order security to stop them. His hands were clasped behind his back. Ilara had just stepped through the kitchen side door when she saw Gareth swaggering across the main courtyard. He walked like a victor chin, held high eyes darting around as if assessing the value of every stone statue in the grounds. Ilara's entire body went rigid. The dust cloth soaked in cleaning solution slipped from her fingers, lying flat on the stone floor. "He's actually doing it. He's going to destroy everything." Ilara dashed out of the kitchen corridor, her old canvas shoes scraping on the floor. She ran straight toward the main hall, stopping right in front of the large parlor doors just as Gareth was a few steps away. Gareth stopped the pungent smell of cheap alcohol, directly contaminating the pure air of the estate. He sneered, extending his rough hand to push Alara aside. "Get out of the way, you brat. I'm here to help you get what you're owed. A millionaire hiring a child to work illegally. Let's see if his standing remains solid after the press learns about this." Alara gripped the door handle tightly, her small shoulders shaking but her eyes resolute. "Uncle Gareth, please leave here. Wasn't taking all my wages enough if Mr. Sterling finds out Mom will be let go immediately? We will have nowhere left to go." Gareth violently shoved Alara's arm. The force of the push made her stumble, her back hitting the solid wooden door. "Your mother is nothing. She's just lying there costing money for medicine. I want the cash from Mr. Sterling's thick wallet. You should thank me because I'm about to make you a little millionaire." Gareth started raising his voice. His shouting echoed throughout the main hall, shattering the dignity the house had maintained for decades. He yelled Alistair Sterling's name, demanding a fair settlement. Alara desperately clung to Gareth's arm, trying to use her weight to pull him back toward the courtyard. "Please, I beg you. I'll work extra night shifts. I'll earn more money for you. Just don't say anything. Leo is waiting for me to bring food home." Just as Alara felt she was about to collapse under Gareth's aggression, the colossal walnut door of the parlor opened. Alistair Sterling stepped out. He was impeccably dressed in a dark suit, his face unlined, his eyes sharp as a newly drawn blade. His appearance caused the air in the hall to abruptly drop several degrees. Gareth froze mid-action, his raised arm rigid in the air. Alara released Gareth, stepping back, her head bowed low, her trembling hands hidden behind her back. I apologize, Mr. Sterling. I will get him to leave right away." Alistair did not look at Alara. He directed his gaze straight at Gareth Miller. Instead of calling the security detail to escort the intruder away, as Alara had feared, Alistair slightly inclined his head, extending one hand behind him in a gesture of invitation. "Mr. Miller, correct? I've been waiting for you since early this morning. Please come in. We have much to discuss instead of shouting in the courtyard like this. It's inappropriate for someone who wants to negotiate with me." Gareth was slightly taken aback by the welcome, but greed quickly regained the upper hand. He adjusted his wrinkled collar, tossed his head toward Alara, and stepped into the parlor with the confidence of someone holding all the advantage. Alara was compelled to follow, huddling close to a marble statue in the corner of the room, feeling like a defendant awaiting the final judgment. Gareth flopped onto the expensive leather armchair, his muddy shoes scuffing the handmade silk rug. He began listing his demands. "Mr. Sterling, let's be straightforward. I know everything. This girl Alara is only 13 years old. You're in serious violation of child labor protection guidelines. Just one article in the newspaper tomorrow and your career will be ruined. I think $1 million is a cheap price for my silence." Alara heard her heart pounding rapidly in her chest. She looked over at Alistair. He stood by the window, his hands clasped together, his face remaining disturbingly composed. "Mr. Miller, do you truly think the price of truth is that inexpensive? You are attempting to extort a person who retains the best legal team in New York." Gareth laughed loudly, his hand forcefully slapping the armrest of the chair. "Lawyers won't save you. I have the girl's birth certificate. I have her mother as evidence. How will you argue when law enforcement discovers a 13-year-old child cleaning your library?" Alistair turned back slowly, walking toward the desk. He didn't respond to the threat. He opened a drawer, retrieving a thick red file. Alistair slammed the file onto the coffee table right next to where Gareth was sitting. The dry thud of the documents felt like a pronouncement. Alistair picked up a remote control, pressing a button on the large television screen mounted on the wall. "Before demanding $1 million, You should see what I already possess, Gareth." The television screen lit up, displaying black and white images that began to move. Gareth squinted, his smile gradually freezing on his face as he recognized the familiar setting in the footage. The television screen glowed brightly, dispelling the dark corners of the Sterling estate parlor. Gareth Miller stared intently at the images moving slowly across the crisp 4K glass. He saw himself, a disheveled man, snatching a small handbag from a diminutive girl right at the exit of the Queens subway station. His every action, from shoving to rifling through and taking the thin bundle of wages, was clearly visible. Gareth Miller sprang from the chair, his face flushed, then turning ashen. He pointed at the screen, his breathing becoming ragged. "This is fake. You staged this. You used technology to trap me." Alistair remained standing by the desk. He was completely unperturbed by the man's fury. He slowly opened the red file, flipping through the pages of strictly sealed legal documents. "Data doesn't lie, Gareth. I own surveillance systems covering the entire vicinity of this estate and all major transport hubs. You didn't just take the child's money. You are appropriating the livelihood of a family in distress. But that is only the beginning." Alistair tossed a copy of a debt list onto the coffee table. The numbers were printed in bold, accompanied by the names of the 3 largest underground gambling venues in New Jersey. $60,000 in overdue debt. You used all of your wife Clara's medicine money to spend on hopeless card games. You allowed your son Leo to live without basic medical devices just to satisfy your own dependency. I have already contacted your creditors. They are more than willing to provide statements about you fraudulently using the Vance family's name to secure illegal loans. Gareth stumbled backward, hitting the armrest of the chair. He looked over at Alara, who was pressed against the marble statue. His eyes flashed with a final burst of malice. "What did this brat tell you? She's a liar. She snuck into your house to work illegally. Both you and the girl will end up in custody." Alistair walked closer, his steps resolute on the wooden floor. He took out another document bearing the signature of a Fairfield County judge. "I didn't trap anyone, Gareth. I merely collected data. You are a defective variable in this child's life, and I am the best at eliminating system defects. Last night I officially filed a petition for temporary protective custody for Alara and Leo Vance under the sponsorship of the Sterling Corporation. I also have an emergency restraining order against Clara. From this moment on, you have no legal rights over them." Gareth scoffed, attempting to hold on to a shred of false pride. "Who do you think you are? You can't strip me of my rights with just a file." The parlor's side door suddenly opened. 2 police officers and a woman in formal business attire entered. Alistair did not need to introduce them. They walked straight toward Gareth. The woman presented a badge from Child Protective Services. "Mr. Miller, we have a warrant to detain you for questioning regarding attempted extortion, economic abuse, and neglect of a minor. The evidence provided by Mr. Sterling is more than sufficient for us to take you in immediately." Gareth Miller attempted to resist, but the presence of the police officers completely deflated him. He was escorted out through the main door, no longer uttering any threats or shouts. The door closed, restoring the absolute tranquility the parlor was known for. Alara remained standing there, her hands tightly gripping the hem of her gray uniform shirt. Tears streamed down her face, which was pale from the intense stress. She couldn't believe that the specter that had haunted her life for years had vanished so quickly. The sudden relief left her feeling disoriented, like someone who had just stepped out of a dark tunnel and was momentarily blinded by the sunlight. Alistair Sterling did not call Mrs. Perkins to tidy up. He slowly walked toward Alara. In his hand was the worn hardcover notebook that the girl had forgotten the night before. He placed it gently on the coffee table next to Alara. You forgot this. I looked through it. Alara flinched, looking at the notebook and then at Alistair. The fear of her intellectual secret being exposed made her tremble. I apologize. I only picked up discarded papers. I didn't take anything from you. Alistair shook his head. He sat down in the opposite chair, his deep gray eyes looking directly into her brown ones. I am not talking about the scratch papers. I am talking about what you wrote on them. The anatomical diagram of the cochlea, the notes on sound frequency and quantum physics. That is not the knowledge of a typical 13-year-old child. You possess an intellect far superior to the adults I have hired. Why are you here? Why did a brilliant person like you choose to hold a mop and scrub my floors and endure that terrible individual instead of seeking protection? Alara looked down at the notebook. She saw her pencil drawings, the calculations she'd performed in the shadows of the Queen's kitchen. She thought of Leo, of her mother, and of the thousands of doors that had slammed shut in their faces because they lacked money insurance and a voice. I tried. I won the scholarship. But the school doesn't pay my mother's rent. They can't buy medicine for pneumonia. They also don't care if Leo is left behind in his silent world. I chose the only way I knew to keep my family from falling apart. Alistair was silent for a long moment. He realized his own arrogance had caused him to overlook the people who served him for so long. He only cared about results, about perfection, forgetting that behind every shadow was a vibrant life being buried. Do you know how much your intelligence is worth, Alara? You should be in a laboratory or a lecture hall at the most prestigious university in this country. Your presence here scrubbing my floors is a terrible waste for humanity. Alara raised her head. She was no longer crying. The pent-up frustration solidified into a cold determination. She did not reply with spoken words. Her small hands moved in the air, executing a rapid, decisive, and meaningful sequence of ASL American Sign Language signs. Her fingers drew the lines of a brutal truth Alistair had never had to face. Because in this world, people like me are not permitted to have a voice. Alistair watched her hands intently. Although he didn't understand every sign, he felt the pain radiating from them. He realized that over the past 13 days, Alara had been communicating so much to him through the order she created, through the meticulousness in the medicine cabinet and the precision of the sharpened pencils. He had just been too preoccupied to listen to a language without sound. Outside the window, the sun's rays began to stream through the fog of Greenwich, illuminating the parlor and Alara's final signs. Alistair stood up. He did not speak of the future, nor promise anything distant. He simply and quietly pulled the curtains wide open, letting the light flood the room as if affirming that from this moment on, darkness would have no place to hide here. Alistair Sterling stood motionless in the parlor, his gray eyes fixed on Alara's hands, which had just lowered. Her final sequence of ASL signs was like an electric current running straight into his mind, shattering the shell of arrogance he had painstakingly constructed for years. Not permitted to have a voice. That phrase was not only Alara's sorrow, it was a damning indictment of his own indifference. Alistair looked into her brightly shining brown eyes, realizing that the perfection he had pursued was merely an empty library if he allowed these small geniuses to be stifled in the dark. He walked toward the window where the sunlight was beginning to illuminate the main hall. Alistair did not call security or his lawyer right away. He turned back to Alara, nodding slowly like a silent vow. You have spoken your piece. Now it is my turn to take action. 1 week later, the Sterling estate was no longer a cold glass fortress. Alistair ordered the staff to pull open all the heavy velvet curtains on every floor. The bright sunlight of a Connecticut morning flooded every corner, chasing away the stale smell of dry documents. In the central library, the space was now filled with new vitality. Clara no longer lay on the torn mattress in Queens. Alistair had used his power and finances to move her into a high-end rehabilitation center near the estate. Top medical professionals were implementing a specialized treatment plan for her lungs. Clara could now sit up. She no longer had to worry about being let go or the threats from Gareth. Each afternoon, she looked out the hospital window where there were lush green trees and knew her children were safe. In the library, the sound of turning pages was steady. Leo sat on a soft rug next to the physics bookshelf. He was dressed in new, clean clothes. Behind Leo's ear was the most advanced hearing device Alistair had personally selected from a partner company. Leo was no longer trapped in the silent world. He looked up when he heard the sound of a bird singing outside the balcony. Leo's eyes widened, filled with pure surprise and curiosity. He turned to the ASL tutor sitting next to him, his hands signing continuously. "Bird sounds. Is that a bird sound?" The tutor smiled and nodded, signing back new vocabulary for the sounds of nature. Leo laughed radiantly, a smile no longer burdened by fear. He had begun to learn how to connect with the world using both his ears and his hands. On the opposite side, Alara sat at the large walnut table. She wore a simple pale blue sweater, her dark hair neatly brushed. On the table there were no longer mops or dirty cloths, but academic files and an important agreement. Alistair pushed a small box toward the girl. "Open it, Alara." Alara held the box. Inside was a hard plastic name tag with an embedded electronic chip. The card bore the inscription, "Alara Vance, Auditory Technology Research Intern." Alistair looked at her, his eyes now full of respect. "I am no longer employing you as a housekeeper. You do not belong with cleaning rags. As of today, you are my associate. You will help the engineers at the Sterling Corporation understand what hearing aid users truly need. Your intellect is the most valuable asset in this house." Alara touched the intern card. She felt its weight so different from the weight of the old backpack containing dry bread from before. Alistair took out another stack of documents, placing them neatly next to the employment agreement. "And this is your acceptance letter. The principal of Manhattan High School has reinstated your admission. Your scholarship is not only restored, but it will become a perpetual scholarship until you attend university. A car will be waiting for you at the gate every morning." Alara looked at the words on the acceptance letter. She felt a profound sense of relief spreading through her chest. She didn't have to lie, didn't have to bow her head, and most importantly, she didn't have to hide her intelligent hands anymore. Alara picked up a pen, signing her name on the enrollment papers with decisive strokes. Alistair picked up another document, the most important one for his own life. He signed his name forcefully at the bottom of the Lydia and Vance Fund. "Henderson has completed the legal procedures. Gareth Miller will never be able to approach your family again. This fund will be named after my sister and you. It will be a shield for children left behind in the loopholes of the law. You will be the fund's first advisor, so we can find other children who are also living as shadows, just as you once were." Alistair walked toward the large window, his hand grasping the cord of the last curtain and pulling it open. The sunlight burst forth brilliantly, enveloping both of them. Alistair felt as though he had just emerged from a decade-long legal battle with his own conscience. He didn't protect Alara just for money. He protected her to save the part of himself that had gone silent since Lydia's passing. The perfection he had long pursued had finally found its true form, the freedom of a recognized intellect. Alara stood up, gathering her school supplies into her new backpack. She approached Alistair, looking at the man of steel now standing in the sunlight. Thank you, Mr. Sterling. I used to believe this world only had darkness and cold, rigid procedures. Alistair smiled a rare and genuine smile. I am the one who should thank you, Alara. You taught me how to see things that security cameras could never capture. A gentle horn sounded from the main gate. It was the Manhattan High School student shuttle. Alara slung her backpack over her shoulder and walked out of the library. She no longer walked like a shadow. Her steps were decisive, her head held high, walking toward the light. As she descended the marble steps of the estate, Alara paused. She turned back, looking at Alistair, who was standing on the second-floor balcony. In the vast space of Greenwich, Alara raised her hand. She performed a single ASL sign slowly, and with deep emotion, her hand closed and then opened from the direction of her mouth directed toward Alistair. Thank you. Alistair stood silently on the balcony. He did not sign back, but he pulled the curtain wide open, standing proudly in the radiant sunrise. He watched the car carrying Alara slowly roll out of the iron gate, merging into the traffic heading toward the city. The Sterling Fortress was no longer a place to escape the past. It had become a starting point for new futures. The dark subway ride of days past was now a distant memory. A new journey had truly begun for two souls who had once been damaged under the clear blue sky of a new day full of hope. The Vance mother and daughter were no longer invisible servants, and Alistair Sterling was no longer a blind millionaire. They had seen each other, and in this world, that is the greatest marvel. The story of Alara and Alistair is a thought-provoking modern parable about the true value of people and the power of compassion. It teaches us that genius knows no class and that hardship may obscure opportunity, but can never extinguish the light of knowledge within a resilient soul. Millionaire Alistair's true wealth did not lie in the glass castle or the immense fortune, but in the moment he decided to use his influence to become a shield, protecting the unseen potential that society had forgotten. When we are brave enough to see through the dust of adversity and reach out to help another, that is also the moment we find redemption for our own pain, turning past brokenness into the foundation for a brilliant new dawn of hope. Note: the story above is entirely fictional. Character names, locations, and events have been created for the purpose of illustrating an educational and artistic message. Any resemblance to real people or actual events is purely coincidental.